Welcome back, wanderers. I am the mysterious nomad, bringing you another grim reality log from the darkest corners of our world. There is a specific kind of terror reserved for the deep woods, a primal fear that sleeps in our DNA until the trees close in behind us. If you want to keep these logs open and survive the long nights ahead, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Today, we are traveling deep into the isolated mountains of West Virginia. Have you ever felt the sudden, suffocating silence of an ancient forest? That precise moment when the birds stop singing, the wind dies down, and the terrible realization dawns on you that you are no longer alone. Listen closely, and whatever you do, do not run. It was late October of 1998. I was 26 years old, arrogant, and foolishly confident in my survival skills. I had planned a 5-day, off-trail hike deep into the Appalachian wilderness. I wanted total isolation. I wanted to escape the noise of the city, the hum of fluorescent lights, and the endless chatter of other people. I parked my beaten-up truck at a desolate trailhead, hoisted my 45-pound pack onto my shoulders, and walked straight into the tree line. For the first 24 hours, it was exactly what I needed. The air was crisp, smelling heavily of damp earth and decaying pine needles. The only sounds were the crunch of dead leaves beneath my heavy boots and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. The Appalachian Mountains are some of the oldest in the world. When you walk through them, especially off the beaten path, you can feel that age. They do not feel welcoming. They feel patient. They feel like they are waiting for you to make a mistake. By the afternoon of day 2, I had ventured miles away from any known trail or logging road. The canopy above had grown so dense that the sunlight barely pierced through, casting the forest floor in a permanent, hazy twilight. I was making good time, pushing through thick brush and navigating steep, rocky inclines. Then, around 4 p.m., the woods changed. It did not happen gradually. It happened in the space of a single heartbeat. The wind, which had been rustling the high branches all morning, simply stopped. The distant chatter of squirrels and the chirping of insects were cut off as if someone had thrown a switch. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy. It pressed against my eardrums, thick and suffocating. I stopped walking. I held my breath, straining to hear anything. A creeping sensation crawled up the back of my neck, the undeniable, biological alarm bell that tells you prey is being watched by a predator. I slowly turned my head, scanning the dense thickets of oak and hickory. At first, I saw nothing but shadows and the gray bark of ancient trees. But as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, my gaze locked onto the opposite side of a shallow, rocky ravine, about 60 yards away. Standing perfectly still among the trees was a man. My brain tried to reject the image. Out here, miles from civilization, you expect to see a bear, or a deer, or maybe a heavily geared hunter in camouflage. You do not expect to see a man wearing a dark, pinstriped suit. It looked like something from the 1920s, covered in a thick layer of pale dust, as if he had just crawled out of a collapsed coal mine. He was impossibly tall, easily over 6.5 feet, and his limbs were unnaturally thin, hanging at his sides like dead branches. He had no backpack, no water, no hiking boots. But it was his face that rooted my boots to the soil. His skin was the color of old parchment. And he was smiling. It was not a friendly smile. It was a massive, exaggerated grin that stretched far too wide across his gaunt face, exposing too many teeth. The smile did not reach his eyes. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and fixed directly on me. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, separated by the ravine. The silence was deafening. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct I had screamed at me to drop my heavy pack and sprint in the opposite direction. My muscles tensed, ready to bolt. But as I took half a step backward, the man in the suit twitched. His neck snapped slightly to the side, his smile widening by a fraction of an inch, and his body leaned forward, as if he was coiled like a spring, just waiting for me to trigger the chase. A cold bucket of dread washed over me. I slowly lowered my foot back to the ground. I took a deep breath, forced myself to look away from his face, and began to walk. Not fast. Not slow. Just a steady, methodical pace, following the edge of the ravine. Every few minutes, I dared to glance over my shoulder. He was no longer standing where I first saw him. But occasionally, through the gaps in the trees, would catch a glimpse of dark fabric moving silently parallel to me. He was following me. And the sun was beginning to set. The woods darkened quickly. By 5:30 p.m., the hazy twilight had deepened into a thick, bruising purple. I was walking entirely on adrenaline, my legs burning with every step up the rocky terrain. The silence was still absolute, save for the crunch of my boots. I had not looked back across the ravine for over an hour. I told myself he was gone. I told myself it was a hallucination brought on by fatigue and isolation. But the hair on my arms remained standing straight up. I could feel the weight of his unblinking stare pressing into the space between my shoulder blades. I needed to make camp before pitch black hit, but I was terrified to stop moving. As I crested a small, densely wooded ridge, I caught the unmistakable stench of mildew and rot. A few yards ahead, half buried under a pile of dead ferns and fallen branches, was a tent. It was an old canvas of frame, faded to a sickly yellow-green. It looked like it had been sitting there for years. The fabric was slashed and sagging, covered in dark blooms of mold. Against my better judgment, I approached it. The survivalist part of my brain whispered that finding an abandoned camp out here was a bad sign. A very bad sign. Lying half inside the ruined flap of the tent was a canvas backpack. It was torn to shreds, as if wild animals had dragged it through the briars, though there were no bones or scattered gear. Just the bag, and protruding from one of the ripped side pockets, a small, leather-bound notebook. I pulled it free. The leather was stiff and waterlogged, the pages swollen and warped by seasons of rain. I carefully peeled back the cover. Most of the ink had bled into illegible blue smears, but near the middle of the book, a few pages had survived. The handwriting was not neat. It was frantic. Deeply grooved into the paper, as if the writer had been trembling violently. The first legible sentence read, "I saw him again today. He is always smiling." My breath hitched in my throat. I read on, squinting in the failing light. "He wears a dead man's suit. He does not speak. He does not sleep. If you look away, he gets closer. But you must not run. God help you, do not run." I ran on the second day. I panicked. That was my mistake. When you run, the smile gets bigger. When you run, he stops walking and starts hunting. Act like he is not there. Walk slow. Look at the trees. If he thinks you are afraid, he will close the distance. I can hear him outside the canvas right now. Do not run. The journal ended there. The rest of the pages were blank. I dropped the notebook into the dirt. A sickening wave of nausea hit my stomach. I looked up into the darkening trees. The shadows were lengthening, merging together into a solid wall of black. And standing just at the edge of my vision, perhaps 100 feet away now, was the tall, impossibly thin silhouette. Even in the gloom, I could see the pale, stark white of his exposed teeth. He had crossed the ravine. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. I bent down, picked up my heavy pack, and slung it over my shoulders with slow, deliberate movements. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely secure the chest strap. I forced myself to take a deep, slow breath. I turned my back to the grinning man and began to walk away at a casual, agonizingly normal pace. I found a small clearing a mile away just as the last sliver of daylight vanished. I set up my small dome tent entirely by touch, too terrified to turn on my flashlight and announce my exact location to the dark. I crawled inside my sleeping bag fully clothed, leaving my boots on. I zipped the nylon door shut. The thin fabric of the tent suddenly felt like paper. I lay there in the pitch black, my hunting knife gripped so tightly in my right hand that my knuckles ached. For hours, there was nothing. Just the freezing mountain air seeping through the nylon, dropping the temperature down to what felt like 30 degrees. Exhaustion pulled at my eyelids, but my brain refused to shut down. Then, at exactly 3 a.m., I heard it. Crack. It was the distinct sound of a heavy dry branch snapping underfoot. It came from about 50 feet to my left. My eyes flew open in the dark. I stopped breathing. A moment later, another sound. The slow, dragging rustle of dead leaves. It was not the light, frantic scurrying of a raccoon or the heavy, clumsy crashing of a bear. It was a rhythmic, bipedal footstep. Step. Drag. Pause. Step. Drag. Pause. The footfalls were heavy, made by hard-soled shoes, not soft hiking boots. He was circling the tent. The footsteps grew closer. 40 feet. 30 feet. 10 feet. The smell hit me then. It was not the smell of the forest. It was the dry, suffocating odor of ancient dust, mothballs, and old, undisturbed earth. It smelled like the inside of a sealed coffin. The footsteps stopped right outside the thin nylon wall of my tent, inches from my head. The moonlight broke through the canopy just enough to cast a shadow against the tent fabric. It was the unmistakable silhouette of his impossibly long legs and thin torso. He was standing there, looming over my shelter. I lay frozen, staring up at the shadow. My heart was pounding so violently against my ribs I was certain he could hear it. My lungs burned for air, but I forced myself to take only shallow, silent sips through my nose. Remember the journal, I thought. Do not acknowledge him. Do not show fear. Then, the shadow shifted. Slowly, agonizingly, the silhouette began to lower. He was bending down. The fabric of the tent depressed slightly as something hard and pointed pressed against the outside. It was a finger. It slowly traced a long, agonizing line down the nylon, right beside my face. I could hear the dry, raspy scrape of his skin against the material. I closed my eyes. I forced my muscles to go completely limp. I focused every ounce of my willpower into mimicking the steady, rhythmic breathing of a deep sleep. Inhale for 4 seconds. Exhale for 4 seconds. Every instinct screamed at me to slash blindly through the tent with my knife, to scream, to run into the night. But I pictured the frantic handwriting in the waterlogged journal. When you run, he stops walking and starts hunting. I lay there for 2 solid hours. The shadow did not move. The dragging finger remained pressed against the nylon. The smell of dust and earth choked the small space. I kept my breathing perfectly even as silent tears of absolute terror tracked down my cold cheeks. I had to convince this thing that I was completely, blissfully unaware of the nightmare standing inches away from my throat. The sun did not rise so much as the darkness simply diluted into a pale, sickly gray. I had not slept a single second. My entire body was cramped and locked into a rigid posture from lying completely motionless on the hard ground for 6 hours. The shadow had vanished from the side of my tent shortly before dawn, but the heavy, suffocating silence remained. I knew he was out there. I knew he was waiting for me to unzip the nylon flap, waiting to see if the terror had finally broken me. I forced myself to sit up. My joints popped loudly in the quiet space. I unzipped the sleeping bag with steady hands. I packed my gear methodically inside the tent, stuffing the bag into its sack, rolling up my sleeping pad, doing everything with agonizing slowness. I had to perform the mundane routine of a hiker who had enjoyed a perfectly normal night of rest in the woods. When there was nothing left to pack but the tent itself, I unzipped the front door. The cold morning air hit my face. I stepped out into the clearing. I stretched my arms over my head and let out a tired, artificial yawn. Every muscle in my neck screamed to snap left and right, to scan the tree line, to find the threat. I did not let them. I kept my gaze fixed on the dirt beneath my boots as I dismantled the tent poles and rolled up the damp fabric. Only when my pack was fully loaded and strapped to my chest did I allow myself to look up. He was standing 40 feet away, partially obscured by the thick trunk of a massive oak tree. The pale dust on his dark, pinstriped suit seemed to catch the weak morning light. His head was tilted slightly downwards, but those wide, unblinking eyes were locked onto me. And the smile. The smile was impossibly wider than the day before, stretching the parchment skin of his cheeks so tight I thought it might tear. I took a sip from my water bottle, wiped my mouth with the back of my trembling hand, and turned my body exactly 180 degrees away from him. I began the long, excruciating trek back toward Highway 81. The next 48 hours were a blur of psychological torture. The journal had been right. If he do not run, he does not hunt. But he does follow. He shadowed my every step. I would walk for 2 hours, maintaining a painfully casual pace of maybe 2 miles an hour. If I stopped to rest my burning legs, I would hear the heavy, dragging scrape of his leather shoes stop just seconds after I did. Whenever I casually glanced over my shoulder to check my bearings, I would see him. Sometimes he was 50 yards back, standing perfectly straight in a patch of ferns. Sometimes he was walking parallel to me on a high ridge, his long, thin legs taking impossible, silent strides that matched my pace exactly. I did not eat. I could not stomach the thought of opening a protein bar while that rotting, earthy smell periodically drifted over me on the wind. I drank only when I absolutely had to, too afraid to pause by a stream long enough to run my water filter. By the afternoon of the second day, I was severely dehydrated, stumbling over exposed tree roots, my mind fraying at the edges. Hallucinations began to bleed into reality. I kept thinking I could hear him whispering from right behind my ear, a dry, papery sound like dead leaves scraping together. But I never broke my pace. I never broke into a jog. I just kept putting one heavy boot in front of the other. Finally, around 3 p.m. on the third day since I entered the woods, the density of the trees began to break. The steep incline leveled out, and I heard it. The faint, beautiful, mechanical roar of an 18-wheeler shifting gears in the distance. Highway 81. The surge of adrenaline was almost my undoing. I wanted to drop my heavy pack and sprint the last mile. My calves twitched with the suppressed urge to run. But the smell of dust and mothballs suddenly grew overpowering. I glanced to my right. He was 20 feet away. It was the closest he had been in the daylight. His arms were raised slightly from his sides, his long, pale fingers twitching, the tendons in his neck standing out in sharp relief. He knew I was close to the edge. He was begging me to run. He was waiting for that one, final slip of control so he could close the distance before I reached the asphalt. I bit down on the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted copper. I looked away from him, locked my eyes on the thinning tree line, and kept walking at exactly 2 miles an hour. 10 minutes later, I pushed through a thick wall of briars and stumbled onto the gravel shoulder of the highway. The bright afternoon sun blinded me. Cars whipped past at 70 miles an hour. I collapsed onto my knees, the gravel tearing through my heavy hiking pants, and I wept. I wept from sheer exhaustion, from dehydration, and from the overwhelming release of terror. When I finally caught my breath, I turned around and looked back at the forest. The tree line stood like a solid green wall. And standing just inside the shadows, where the sunlight could not reach, was the tall man in the pinstriped suit. He did not step onto the gravel. He did not cross the boundary. He just stood there, his hands hanging limply at his sides. The grin was gone. His face was a blank, terrifying slate of disappointment. As a passing semi-truck blasted its horn behind me, I blinked, and the space among the trees was empty. I have never been back to the Appalachian woods. I sold all of my camping gear the week I returned home. Some people say the mountains are a place of peace, a place to connect with nature. But I know better. The deep woods do not belong to us. They belong to things that have been walking under those ancient canopies long before we built our roads and our cities. Things that abide by a different set of rules. Rules that are written in the dirt by those who did not make it out. If you ever find yourself miles off the trail and the silence falls like a heavy blanket, remember the warning. Pay attention to the shadows. And whatever you do, no matter how much your instincts scream at you to flee, do not run. If you want to keep these logs open, leave a like and subscribe to Grim Reality Logs. Let me know in the comments which story kept you up tonight. Stay safe.